Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, if you guys been watching my channel for a while, then I'm sure as you guys know, a few months back, I made a couple of videos talking about Akita and her finally being back, with Akita appearing in a comic in a Ninjago magazine. Well, today we've actually gotten an update on that situation because when it comes to Akita, she's going to be returning again in an upcoming Ninjago comic in a magazine, which is something that honestly I am really excited about. So in today's video, I want to take a look at the information that we've been given so far when it comes to this, discuss my thoughts on it, and why I'm really happy about this. So let's get into this whole thing. So for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to the Ninjago comics, I'll give you guys the short version of the whole situation. When it comes to Ninjago, it does receive comics inside of magazines because, for those of you who don't know, there are in fact official magazines for Ninjago. However, when it comes to the Ninjago magazine, it is something that is exclusive to Europe. And when it comes to these magazines, they contain a variety of different things, including stuff like quizzes, posters, information about the seasons, and more. And when it comes to that more stuff, it includes comics, with comics being included in every single magazine. And when it comes to one of the magazines, specifically the 104th issue of the Ninjago magazine, in the comic that we got for that magazine, Akita made an appearance in that comic. Granted, it was just a shadowy silhouette of her, and we didn't properly see her, and that was just a small cameo appearance. However, when it comes to this upcoming comic that Akita is going to be in, it looks like she's actually going to be playing a central role when it comes to the story of that comic, which is something that honestly I am really looking forward to. So now let's actually take a look at stuff when it comes to the comic and analyze things. So, when it comes to the information that we have been given so far when it comes to the comic, it isn't really that much, because at this point we've only been given one singular panel from the comic, and that's it, and it wasn't even in a magazine that was specific to Ninjago. Instead, it's a magazine for LEGO in general, but still, the stuff that we do see in this one panel, it is pretty interesting. So for starters, obviously, we have Akita being back, and this is something that I am really happy about, considering the fact that Akita is one of my favorite characters when it comes to Ninjago, and something I've been discussing for a while is the idea of her returning, so I'm really glad that we're finally getting a chance to see her again. However, that's not all, because in addition to Akita returning, we're also seeing the return of Vex. And this is something else that I really like, because Vex is one of my favorite villains when it comes to Ninjago. Vex is overall my fourth favorite antagonist when it comes to Ninjago, with the Overlord being at number 3, Garmadon in the number 2 spot, and Moro being my overall favorite villain. But still, when it comes to Vex returning, this is something that I am really looking forward to, because again, he's one of my favorite Ninjago villains of all time, and I think it's absolutely amazing that we're finally getting a chance to see him back as well. However, even that's not it, because something else that we get a chance to see when it comes to this panel is Lloyd and Akita finally being reunited with one another after all this time. And this is by far the number one thing that I am the most happy about when it comes to Akita returning, given that when it comes to Akita returning, something that I have been talking about for a while is that personally I really want to see her and Lloyd be reunited after all this time, especially considering the fact that the ending of the Ice chapter did set up the idea of Lloyd and Akita finally getting the chance to reunite after all this time, and now we're seeing exactly that with Lloyd and Akita finally being reunited after all this time when it comes to Ninjago. And honestly, I couldn't be happier about this, and I'm legitimately interested in seeing what this comic is going to be doing with these two, with them finally being reunited after all this time. It's something that I am really looking forward to. However, that's not all, as there's a few other interesting things to take a look at when it comes to this panel. For starters, we see that when it comes to Lloyd and Akita, the two of them are both carrying these white plates on their back for some reason. It's not entirely clear why they're doing this, although given that this is just one singular panel from a comic, I feel like the rest of the comic is obviously going to explain why these two are holding onto these plates in the first place. However, that's not all, as something else really interesting that we see is Vex being chased by a giant bird for some reason. Now, once again, we don't really know why this is happening. given that at this point we don't know that much about the comic, but I'm sure that when it comes to the comic, when it is ultimately released in the magazine, we will finally get a full explanation on what exactly is going on here. And when it comes to the scenario, I've seen some people theorize that when it comes to Akita and Vex, potentially the two of them were working together and they ended up encountering this bird. And that's something that I'm not entirely sure about. Or at the very least, I feel like if these two are working together, it's not willingly. Given everything that happened between these two during the events of the Ice chapter, there's no way I could see these two willingly helping each other out as allies. So instead, I could see these two more or less working together for the sake of survival rather than actually being willing to help each other out. Or maybe it's possible these two aren't actually helping out each other at all and there's something else that's going on here. Which personally, I feel like that would make more sense than these two working together, especially considering, again, the history between these two characters. Either way, though, stuff is pretty unclear, so we're just gonna have to wait and see what happens. However, one other really interesting thing about this situation is Lloyd, because if you take a look at Lloyd, you can clearly see that Lloyd is wearing his core outfit, given that Lloyd is wearing his core mask, which obviously raises the question, when exactly would this take place when it comes to the timeline, and also, is this comic even canon to the events of the show at all? So, starting off with the question of the canonicity of this comic, this is something that we're really just gonna have to wait and see what happens when we get the full comic. Because when it comes to the comics that are released in the Ninjago magazines, they aren't always canon to the events of the show. Some of them definitely are canon, like for example, prior to the release of Crystallized, there were some comics that were meant to tie in between the events of Seabound and Crystallized, and those comics are meant to be canon, especially since those comics ended up tying directly into some stuff with Lloyd for early on during the events of Crystallized. So it's entirely possible that when it comes to this comic, this could be one of the canon comics, although it's also possible that this may not be canon, but at this point we genuinely don't know, considering we don't really have that much information about the comic at this point. Meanwhile, when it comes to the timeline placement, this is a pretty tricky question to answer, given the fact that when it comes to Lloyd, he is wearing his core outfit. And we know that when it comes to the show, there was really only one instance in which Lloyd was wearing his core outfit when it comes to Dragons Rising, and that was right after the merge happened, as we saw that Lloyd was in his core outfit after it happened. So it's possible that when it comes to this moment, it's something that could have taken place sometime shortly after the merge. Maybe Lloyd decided to go exploring around the merged world and he ended up running into Akita. That is a possibility. Although, one thing that does potentially throw a wrench into this idea is the fact that Lloyd has his core mask, which he did lose at the beginning of Dragons Rising. However, even then, I don't really think that's a deal breaker when it comes to this potentially taking place sometime prior to the events of Lloyd changing up his suit. Given that, for one, we've seen in multiple Ninjago seasons that the ninja do have multiple versions of their suits, so the idea that Lloyd could just get a different mask from another core suit that he has isn't an impossibility, but also we know based on the earlier seasons that Lloyd is really good at sewing, so maybe it's possible that when it comes to Lloyd, he just made himself a brand new mask altogether. That's also a possibility. Or maybe the people who made this comic just overlooked that detail of Lloyd not having his core mask. That's also a possibility, but ultimately we are just going to have to wait and see what happens. However, I feel like it's also possible that when it comes to this comic, it could potentially take place sometime after the merge initially happened, and it could take place sometime in between the events of Dragons Rising, because something that I've seen Ninjago fans talk about is the idea that when it comes to the ninja's core suits, these could potentially be the suits that the ninja wear in between the times when they get their new suits for the season, which wouldn't be something new for the show, given that this is exactly what we saw with the Season 11 suits back during the events of the Wild Brain era of the show, with the ninja wearing these suits whenever they didn't have their new suits for the season. So maybe when it comes to the core suits, it can be the exact same kind of scenario. Maybe the ninja could just end up wearing these suits in between the times when they get their new suits for the season. That is a possibility, and who knows, maybe this comic could potentially take place in between the events of seasons 1 and 2 of Dragons Rising, or maybe even sometime in between season 2, part 1, and part 2. At this point, we really don't know, and we're just gonna have to wait and see what happens. But either way, when it comes to the timeline placement of this comic, if it is indeed canon, I feel like it's safe to say it would most likely take place sometime prior to Lloyd meeting up with the other members of the ninja team, but it's also entirely possible it could take place sometime after that, because at this point we really don't have that much information to go on, so we're just gonna have to wait and see. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So, yeah, when it comes to Akita, she's finally gonna be coming back after all this time, which, again, I genuinely could not be happier about this. Again, when it comes to Akita, she is one of my favorite characters when it comes to the franchise, and I have really wanted to see her back in the show for such a long time, especially after the ending of season 11 set up the idea of her returning and her and Lloyd finally reuniting. And with Akita appearing in this comic, we're finally getting both those things. We're properly seeing her return when it comes to Ninjago, and her and Lloyd are finally going to get the chance to reunite. And honestly, I could not be happier about this. Now, with that being said though, there is one thing about this comic that I do want to bring up, and it's that I do honestly have a pretty similar feeling about this comic as I do when it comes to the book Quest for the Lost Powers. And what I mean by that is I do wish that this is something that was happening in the show and it wasn't being relegated to some kind of external media thing for Ninjago. Honestly, I do think it would have been really cool if we got a chance to see Akita return in the show prior to her showing up in a comic, especially considering just how long it's been since we have seen her back in the show, and seeing her returning in a comic first. Again, admittedly, I would have liked to see Akita back in the show first, or even in a YouTube short. That's also something that I would have been fine with. But honestly, the fact that Akita is returning at all, I will honestly take what I can get. And who knows, maybe Akita will show up in the show proper at some point. I really hope that does, and I really hope that when it comes to Akita's appearances in Dragons Rising, they aren't relegated to comics in magazines that are exclusive to Europe, meaning not every Ninjago fan is going to be able to get access to it, especially when it comes to Ninjago fans like me who are from America. But again, like I said, I'll honestly take what I can get because, again, I'm just really happy that Akita is finally going to be returning after all this time, and I cannot wait to see what's going to be happening in this comic. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. But before I wrap up, there are a couple things that I want to say first. For starters, I want to give a really big shout out to Spinjitzu Lady because just like when it came to my initial video that I made talking about Akita being back, she is the reason why I'm making this video in the first place, because I saw a community post that she made showing this comic panel on it, and I knew I had to make a video about it in order to share with other people. Although Tanner Fishies beat me to the punch, and he also made a video discussing it. But still, I wanted to make a video anyway discussing it, because again, I just really like Akita, and I'm glad she's finally back after all this time. And so, yeah, that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So, tell me down below what do you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to Akita's return. Again, tell me down below, and I hope you guys enjoy. Later, guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.